In this edition of The Nerd Is In, I'm going to show you how to create your first Windows Form Hello World application using C#. Now we're going to be using the compiler Visual Studio Community Edition 2019. Now I just threw a lot of terminology at you, but it's not hard, so let's jump in. As we jump into creating our first Visual Studio project, in C#, there's a few things I just want to point out to you for you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this. Things to remember. When we're creating our project, you're going to add your Windows controls to the form first. Step 1. Step 2, we need to set the name property of each and every one of those controls before we go into our code window. Otherwise, our events, our functions, the names of our functions are just going to have a default name like button 1 or text box 1 instead of something that makes sense. After you've done that, you're going to write your code. Now, what are some of the gotchas? You got to remember, like C++, C# is case sensitive. A capitalized letter and a lowercase letter are not the same thing. You have to get your upper and lowercase right. When you name something, if you capitalize it, when you reference it in your code window, you better capitalize it. Otherwise, you're going to get a weird error. Another thing I see a lot of people have trouble with is, where the heck did I just save my project I created? I can't find it. I need to copy it to my memory stick. I need to move it. I'll show you that. And I'm also going to show you how to get back into your project. So now we're ready to create our first Hello World application using C# for Windows. So you need Visual Studio 2019. If you don't have that, please watch my video on how to download and install it. But we're going to hit the Start menu here because you're not going to have a shortcut on your desktop. You're not going to have it on your taskbar the first time you go to run it. So we've got to find it on this Start menu. Let's search down. Could it be under the M's for Microsoft? The answer is no, but we'll keep going and eventually we'll find it. Yes, under the V's for Visual Studio. Isn't that what a relief? You know, I thought I was in a reality TV show there trying to build up some false drama. Anyway, I'm going to right click on this and say Pin to Start. That's not where I want it. Let me drag it down here. And then I'm going to launch it, and I'll leave it up to you if you want to add a desktop shortcut or pin it to your taskbar. But I like to pin it to my Start menu up where I have it handy. You're not going to have recent projects because you're going to be creating your very first project, so you won't see these. But what we want to do is come over here to Create New Project. Now, once you do this, you're going to be overwhelmed by the number of types of projects you can create in Visual Studio. Look, it just goes on and on and on. So let's make our life easier. If I come up here to Languages, I want C#. For platforms, I want Windows. And for project types, I want Desktop. Now, it's not quite the top item, but this is the one I want. I want Windows Form App for .NET Framework, C#, Desktop Windows. This is the type of project I want to create. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to say Next. So what are we going to call this project? Well, we already discussed that. You can call yours whatever you want. Don't recommend you use profanity. Where's it going to save my project? Well, if we look right here, it's going to be saved under Source, Repos for like repository, like my code repository. I don't want to save it there. I'm going to hit ... and I'm going to switch to my Nerd is in folder, code. So it's going to be under Documents, the Nerd is in code. That's where I want all my projects to be saved. It's going to be called Hello World. I got that named. I got the location. Everything's happy. I can hit Create. And here's my first project. Now, it's probably going to look like this for you because you're not going to have your toolbox pinned up. You also might have this message here telling you you're scrolled in, you're zoomed in. I'm happy with this zoom level. I'm going to hit the X button to get rid of that little warning bar. And I'm going to come over to Toolbox. And once I'm in the toolbox, it's going to look like this for you. Everything's going to be collapsed, but you want to come up here to the top and hit this push pin so that your toolbox is always open, and then you're going to want to open your common controls. This is all the different types of Windows controls we would use in a regular Windows program. In this project, we're going to be interested in label, text box, and button. Now, to add a control to your form, you could just click on it and rubber band it out, or you can double click and then drag it around. So that's a little bit big for a button. Let's make it like this. Put it where I want it. I want a label above this because I want to display some text in a label. So I'm going to click on the label and let's get a nice big label. Hey, I didn't get a big label. So what's going on here with the label is there's a property of the label control called auto size, and that makes the label just big enough to hold the text that is inside of it. And by default, the first label you add to your project is label 1, so that's how big it makes it. So we're going to fix this in a little bit. Well, we've got our controls in here. If we click on this way over here in my property window, and I tell you what, I'm going to drag this up a little bit to give me more room in the property window, and we want to look at all these different properties, and you see they're listed by category. I like to list them alphabetically, so I'm going to come to the A to Z button right here, click on this, and then if I look through the list, you're going to see auto size, and it's set to true. I can hit the drop down and set it to false, and now you see my label is whatever size I make it. Now the other thing I like to do with my label is change the border style from none to fixed 3D. So now we can see the edges of the label. We've got our button, but the text that is in this label is pretty small. So let's play around with a couple other properties just to make things look a little better. If I come up here to font and click on ... I could change what font I have, but more importantly, I can change the size. So I'm going to make my font say, let's make it size 16. That's a little better, okay? And we'll do the same thing for the button. I'm going to click on the button, hit the font property, and let's make it size 16. So now we've got reasonable size text on our two controls for Hello World. Oops, let me make that a little smaller. Get this centered. That looks pretty good. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, we're going to add our controls. We need to change their names. If we want to manipulate a control in our programming code, we've got to access it by its name. So every control has a name property. If I click on this label, if I come all the way up to the top here, you'll see the name property is label 1. If I added a second label to my form, Visual Studio would name it label 2. Well, this isn't a very good name, so we're going to name it LBL in lowercase letters. It's important. Remember, we have to sweat upper and lowercase. It could be uppercase, but convention is we put a 3-letter prefix at the beginning of the name to tell the other programmers and to remind ourselves this is a label, LBL. And I'm going to call it label display because that's where I'm going to display Hello World. Now I'm going to click on my button, and if I come all the way up here, no surprise, it calls it button 1. Well, I'm going to call this BTN for button hello, because when we click on this button, it's going to display a hello message. So I'm going to press enter, change this name. Now I've changed the name of my controls, but you notice we still have label 1 showing up in the label, and we still have button 1 showing up on the button. That's because that's another property. So I'm going to come back to my property window, go to my text property, and if I was to write Bubba in the text property, the label, press enter, that's what shows up in the label. So for right now, I'm going to delete everything from the text property of the label so the label's empty. My button, if I click on my button now and I go to its text property, I'm going to name this button Hello World. And as soon as I press enter, that's what shows up in the button. So now I've done the two things I needed to do on my controls. I changed the name property of both of the controls to have a good name that's descriptive. Remember, the label is named Label Display with a capital D, remember that. And Hello World button, that button is called BTN Hello. So get everything set up here the way I want it. We're happy with that. Now, this is probably a good point to save my project. Now, in Visual Studio, this is the button you use to save your project. Save all. Do not ever use File, Save As. If you do a Save As, you are saving one part of your project to a different location on the hard drive and leaving the rest of your project where it started out. If you hit Save All, you're staying safe. You're keeping all of your project in that one folder. All right, now we need to write some code so that when we run the program, it says Hello World up here, because that's your traditional first program. How do I get into the code window? Well, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can go to the view window and say view code. But what we're going to do, and what I traditionally do, is you take your command button and you double click on it. So when I double click on this, it's going to open the code window for my command button. So now this code's probably kind of small and hard to see, but if I hold down my control key and use my mouse wheel, I can make the code a little bigger to make it easier to read. So my project is named Hello World, so you notice it has namespace Hello World up here. It's using a bunch of different system resources. For God's sakes, don't ever mess with any of this. Don't ever delete these braces because you will screw everything up. What is the name here? Remember, we named my button Hello, and this is the click event for when you click on that button. When you run your code, anything that's inside of this procedure, inside this function, is going to get run. So what I want to do is put the words Hello World inside the label. So to do that, I've got to write a line of code. Now, what was my label named? Anybody remember? If you can't remember what it is, up here, I can go back to my form, click on the label in question, scroll up in the properties windows, and what is it? It's Label Display. I'm going to go back to my code window over here, and I'm going to say LBL, and as I start to type it, Visual Studio gives me autocomplete. So if I hit the space bar, the only thing in my project, the only thing named in my project that begins with LBL is Label Display. So if I hit Label Display, and then I'm going to say dot text equals double quote Hello World. And then everything in the C# programming language, every line of code has to end with a semicolon. Let's see if I got this right. I'm going to press enter. So if you misspell something, like right here, I'll do a lowercase d, it's going to give me an error. You see the red squiggly line? It says the name label display does not exist in the current context. So it says there is nothing named label display, because if we go look at label display, its name has a capital D. So let me go back to my code window and let me fix this error. So now we're saying when you click on button hello, remember that's its name, button hello, click, change what's in the text property of that label to have the message hello world. Now we got to put it in double quotes because that's how C# knows what the beginning of a string message is and what the end is, okay? So that's just the delimiters that marks the beginning and end of the string. So I think we're ready here to try to run our program. So I'm going to come back out here and just one more detail. You notice up here my window, my Form 1 has the word Form 1 on the title bar. I can click on Form 1 anywhere, go down to the text property, and change its text property. And I'll just change it to hello world, except let me spell it right. And now I want to run my program. I want to see if it works. Well, good habit to get into. First thing, save all. Now we're going to see if we have any typos, if we've broken the programming rules, the syntax of the programming language. So you can do that through the build menu and say build solution, or if you just try to start your project, it will build it. So let me hit start, and down here it says build project started. It said build successful. It's now running the program, but I can't see it. That's because I have dual screen and it's on my other screen. So here's my program running. If I click on the hello world button, it says hello world. Isn't that exciting? I've written my first C# program. Now to close the program, I can hit my X button, go back to my Visual Studio. Everything was working wonderfully. Isn't that fantastic? But what if we want to get a little fancier, be more personalized rather than generic hello world? So I'm going to add a text box. Put it down here. Let's change that pesky font size to 16 again. Let's make it a little wider. Let's change its name. Instead of it being named text box 1, we're going to name it txt name. Okay? So now instead of saying hello world, if I double click on my button again, what we're going to do instead is say hello spacebar plus, now what was the name of that text box? txt name dot text is the property we're interested in. So what this is going to do now is it's going to take whatever we typed into the text box, which goes into the dot text property of that object, and add it to the message hello. So it's going to build a message that says hello spacebar plus whatever we typed into the text box. And then the destination is going to be label display. So this equal sign is not algebra, x equals y plus 5. This equal sign is actually the assignment operator. It says take whatever's on the right-hand side, do it, and put it to what is on the left-hand side. So that's going to put this message into the text property of label display. So let's hit save all. This time I'll say build and build solution. So you see down here it says build succeeded. That's a good sign. Let's start my project and drag it onto the screen here, and I'll type in Bubba. So when I click on Hello World now, it says Hello Bubba. So there's our first C# program. Let me end the program. I could leave this code window up just a little bit in the video so you can see what I typed. And that's how you just create a simple C# project. I'm going to hit save all. Now the next question is, when I get out of my project, where did my code go? So let's go find it. Remember, the default location is actually going to be under this PC, users, and under users, it's going to be under disk drive C, users, whatever your username is, and it's going to be under source repos. So here's a couple projects. But where I created my project was under the Nerd is in code Hello World. So if I go into this folder, you see it has a bunch of subfolders, but more importantly, it has this project solution. All right, so this is a Visual Studio solution. This is the file you double click on to launch your project. Anytime you need to reopen your project, you can just double click on the SLN, the Visual Studio solution. So I'll double click on it and I'll say open it with Visual Studio 2019 always, and it's going to launch it, and I'm going to be back where I was. So I'm back in my code window. I can click onto my form window. So here's my Hello World. Now, if I need to move my project to my memory stick, I need to move this entire folder, not just part of it. Don't ever do a save as inside of Visual Studio, because you see it's got subfolders with subfolders and more subfolders. If you just do a save as, you're only saving one part of your project somewhere else. You're splitting your project into two parts, and we don't want to do that. Keep it all together. Go to the folder where you saved your overall project, right-click, copy, go to your memory stick, paste. Then you can move it around. That's the best way to do it. Now, once again, I'll go back in and double-click on my project to launch it. But that is creating your first C# programming project. Hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe.